The Environmental Justice Advisory Group meeting, South Coast AQMD, here on January 26th at 12 o'clock in room GB. And the first item on the agenda is a call to order and opening remarks. I would like to thank everyone for being here. Sam. As always, and just say that on our agenda today is one of the big issues that we're dealing with, and that's AB 617, legislation that was passed last year and signed by the governor, which is one of the big issues we're dealing with here at South Coast. There's no need to call an ambulance, David. There's a few other owith we're doing a lot of work on some very controversial refinery issues at Torrance Refinery in Valero with modified hydrofluoric acid and what to do about the situations there. We are also trying to figure out how to bring the reclaim cap and trade program for NOx emissions to an end in something of a less than fully chaotic and manner, and continue to implement our air quality management plan, including trying to make use of well north of probably $200 million. Phil probably know how much incentive money we have. It's a lot. We have a lot of incentive money to try to clean up a lot of trucks and equipment, primarily in the field of the freight logistics industry. And so those are all the big things that are going on right now here. Did I miss anything, Counselor?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It's quite thorough.
That pretty much covers the big items. There's many, many other things. In fact, just ask Phil what keeps him up at night and he'll let you know. But I'm sure that covers most of them. The first thing after opening remarks, maybe we should go around the table and just introduce ourselves. I would like to introduce Cody Rosenfield. Cody, say hi to everyone. He is the new policy associate at the Coalition for Clean Air, and he'll be working on freight issues. And I told him he had to come here and meet all of you guys. So if you get a chance during the break, say hi to Cody. Fabian, why don't you start off? We'll go around
Sure.
table.
Welcome, Welcome, Cody, to AQMD. My name is Fabian Weston. I'm the Assistant Deputy Executive Officer for Legislative, Media, and Public Affairs.
My name is David McNeil, Baldwin Hills Conservancy, State of California.
My name is Monique Hernandez. I'm a professor at Cal State LA, and I teach urban pollution.
And I'm Kerry Doy with the community organization called PACE, involved in a lot of environmental justice issues.
Danny Morales.
Retta Alexander.
Larry Beeson, School of Public Health, Loma Linda University.
Evelyn Knight, West Long Beach.
Afif El Hassan, American Lung Association.
Great.
Nancy Feldman, Counsel's Office.
Okay. And Daniela and Dr. Fine, why don't you introduce yourselves? In between bites?
Yep. My name is Daniela Arellano. I'm a senior public information specialist focused on environmental justice in the Legislative Public Affairs and Media Department.
Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer, Planning and Rules Division here at AQMD. I'll be presenting later on the agenda.
Great. Thank you. Members of the public always have the right to address the committee on any agenda item. I assume that no one's interested in addressing opening remarks, but if you are, let me know. Item number 2 is the meeting minutes, and if everyone has taken a look at them, we will entertain a motion to accept them. I know I probably read them when they first got done, so I haven't read them this week. Anyone have any corrections or items in the minutes? David?
I move to adopt the minutes.
Okay. Without objection, and I assume, again, there's no comments from the public on this one, which keeps us moving right along. review of follow-up and action items. Ms. Wesson?
All right, thank you, Dr. Liu. Action item number 1, Ms. Mary Figueroa asked if it was possible for undocumented individuals to be acknowledged when defining environmental justice communities. On our update, staff determined it would not be possible to include undocumented individuals when defining EJ communities because it's difficult to find stats regarding undocumented individuals, as they seldom admit that they're undocumented, and there's not really any databases that we can tap into to find out that information. Action item number 2, Dr. Jill Johnston asked if staff could address cases in which air monitoring data had been requested, but results were difficult to access. She suggested that the partnership help environmental justice communities access data more readily. Dr. Liu indicated that certain data, monitoring data from activities in Paramount, had been made available to the public, but he recognized that that might not be the case across all monitoring efforts. Dr. Johnston requested monitoring data related to an oil drilling site in Los Angeles. Staff followed up with Dr. Johnston, who indicated she wanted more information about the Allen Coal oil drill site in Los Angeles near USC, which a few years ago prompted hundreds of complaints of nosebleeds and respiratory ailments due to its emissions. Staff obtained some monitoring data which indicates that levels of styrene show a downward trend from 2014 to 2017. Annual levels of BTEX were always below the MATES averages. Annual averages of styrene were above the MATES 4 average from 2014 to 2016, but in 2017 it dropped below the MATES 4 average. Levels seem to be slightly higher at the downwind site, which is near the apartments, compared to the upwind site near the park. The long-term average concentrations of all toxics, VOCs, are substantially lower than the chronic REL standards. It was also recommended that Dr. Johnson speak directly with Jason Lowe in monitoring if she wanted more information, and also to introduce a public records request. Action item number 3, Mr. Doyle echoed earlier concerns regarding language barriers and suggested that staff look into broadening AQMD's language reach. Staff spoke to Mr. Doyle, who further recommended we outreach in Chinese, Korean, Cambodian, and Vietnamese. According to Mr. Doe, materials written in Chinese will help us reach 80% of the Asian American population in the LA area. Spoken Chinese is a little different, as the spoken language divides into 2 dialects, Mandarin and Cantonese. There's also a 3rd dialect. Dr. Choi, help me out. Chiucho, is that Chu-Chow? Chu-Chow, okay. Which is the dialect spoken by the most affected populations. Thank you, Mr. Doy. Which is the dialect spoken by the most affected populations of Chinese residents in our area. This only matters when spoken. However, all 3 dialects are the same when written. SCAQMD has translated documents to some of these languages before and has the ability to translate documents to multiple languages. We will consider, and we do, translate meetings and documents depending on the community that we conduct outreach in. So that is something that we're already doing. So we appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Action item number 4, Fabian Wesson discussed the goals and objectives for 2018. Dr. Lawrence Beeson asked if the goals were presented in a specific order within the document. Dr. Liu requested that staff clarify they are not. Dr. Beeson and Dr. Johnston requested that AB 617 be placed on the list. The action item, staff to add AB 617 to the list of goals and objections for 2018 and include a note that states items are not listed in any particular order. Staff updated the document. We have provided you with copies on the table. Action item number 5, Mr. Daniel Morales reported that Assemblymember Elias Reyes Gomez convened a meeting on air quality in San Bernardino. The meeting was attended by universities and other local groups, including Dr. Philip Fine from SCAQMD. Mr. Morales further reported on a meeting convened by Dr. Luis Gonzalez of South Colton regarding the dust issues caused by a local cement plant. According to local residents, dust problems continue to impact the community. Mr. Morales requested that SCAQMD investigate the facility and that staff attend Dr. Gonzalez's next meeting scheduled for January the 13th. Dr. Liu requested that staff follow up with Mr. Morales on the issue. We spoke with Victor Yip from enforcement. There are no new updates, so we did not attend the meeting as we had no new updates, and we have not received any dust complaints from the community. So at this point, there's no updates and there's no complaints, and that's it on the action items.
All right, any committee members? Carrie, you got?
Yeah, just to make sure that I don't offend my friends and all of the other Asian ethnic communities, I did not mean to say that if you write it in Chinese, then you'll be reaching 80% of the population.
Okay.
What I was speaking to was the API population in the San Gabriel Valley and those that are non-English speaking. Okay, and so we would be reaching probably 80% of the non-English speaking Asians in the San Gabriel Valley.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for that
Yeah.
clarification.
That helps. You did mention something that reminded me about the monitoring, and should probably let people know, because I just discovered recently that I knew that we were doing it. I didn't know it had been finalized. We had contracted out with some folks who do some very cutting-edge monitoring of gases at oil wells and refineries and other facilities. And they did a series of studies. There's 3 different studies that were done, also the marine vessels. And those studies have now been finalized, and they are available on the website under, I forget exactly where on the website. It's under monitoring somewhere. So they use some really new technologies and have some very interesting findings. And if Dr. Johnson were here, I'd remember to tell her, but I'll see her again soon, I'm sure. Any other questions or comments from anyone on the committee on the updates? Any members of the public? Hi, Nicole. Introduce yourself to Cody. Cody, introduce yourself to Nicole. Okay. Got that taken care of. Okay, that takes us to getting into the real substance here and the meat of the meeting. Item number 4, which is Dr. Fine talking about AB 617, community identification process. So, Dr. Fine.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Again, Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer, Planning and Rules Division. So many of you hopefully are aware of AB 617, which was a bill that passed last year at the through the state legislature and then signed by the governor. And this bill was part of a kind of a package or an agreement that went through the legislature to extend the state's greenhouse gas cap and trade program. But many in the legislature and around the state were concerned that the cap and trade program wasn't doing enough to address local air quality issues. And so in order to get the cap and trade program extended past 2020, this companion bill really changes the way that not only Air Resources Board, but even more so how the districts approach air quality regulation in some sense, but also how we address those local impacts in communities. So this is a big deal. This changes focus for local air districts, including us. It also has a lot of responsibility that is put on local air districts. So I'll talk a little bit about the elements, and then this presentation kind of goes into how it's going to affect the South Coast Air Quality Management District in particular, and then how we're moving forward with implementation. And there's a lot of unanswered questions, so we don't have all the answers. It's still relatively new. The state has responsibility to come up with statewide guidance, and that has not, has not been finalized, and in some cases hasn't even been released yet. But we are working, there's several working groups, we're working very closely with the California Air Resources Board to try to make sure that this is implemented statewide and at the local level in a very cooperative fashion. So just a little bit of background, there's some key components of AB 617. There's more than this, but these are the three that really are the most important in terms of the work that we do. So there's a large monitoring component. So, and I'll talk a little bit about identifying specific communities, disadvantaged communities with air quality impacts. And there's going to be a lot of monitoring done in those communities, air monitoring, to figure out exactly what those impacts are and potentially what the sources are. Also tracking any progress that could be made towards emission reductions and exposure reduction. There can be, the local air districts are going to be tasked with doing most of this monitoring, but there is also provisions and hope that some will be working with communities to do some of this monitoring as well, kind of a citizen science component. There's also requirements that all the data that's collected in these local communities is gonna be publicly available, which is something we would always do. But there's some requirements that there's going to have to be a statewide system that anyone can go to in order to view the data. Another kind of corollary component to the monitoring are these community emission reduction plans. Again, the communities still need to be identified, and there will be a statewide kind of framework for how these community emission reduction plans are developed and implemented. But it's also, so once the communities are identified and the sources are identified, the idea is actions are going to be taken to improve the air quality in those communities, reduce exposure, and improve public health. So there will be obviously some district or local measures that need to be taken to reduce emissions, but also some state level actions to reduce emissions in those communities, especially when it comes to mobile sources, since the state has more direct authority over mobile sources than the local air districts. These, in my view, are going to look a little bit like miniature air quality management plans for communities and have specific measures, specific actions, specific metrics, tracking, and monitoring, public input, and look a lot like an AQMP. They could last anywhere from a couple years to 5 years or longer, depending how long it might take. Two other elements that are also very important. It had a requirement for best available retrofit control technology implementation. So before this, in state law, there were requirements for best available retrofit control technology in the state for areas that were non-attainment. So we had those requirements. What the legislation did essentially, and it was largely in reaction to our reclaim program, it essentially directs us to require all those facilities that are now under reclaim to install that technology, irregardless of credits and all the trading that went on with reclaim. Essentially, it sunsets the reclaim program. This is something that our board had committed to do anyway, but there's timelines in AB 617 that are a little bit faster than the ones that we had, our board had adopted in the air quality management plan process. So we are hard at work now, dismantling the reclaim program, working on dozens or more of rules to make sure that all the facilities are going to be on a schedule to put on these control technologies. And this is something that affects us probably more than the rest of the state because we already had these we had reclaim, we had the only cap and trade program. However, other parts of the state didn't have the same BARC requirements because they were not necessarily in these extreme non-attainment areas, but if they have a cap and trade facility, that will also have to implement BARC regardless of their attainment status. So that's the bigger issue for some other parts of the state. A fourth element is emissions reporting. There's a call for some kind of uniform statewide emission reporting system. We currently collect emissions data from all our facilities. We audit that data and we pass it on to the state. There are some slight differences in how that is done at different air districts throughout the state, and this is a push to try to make it more uniform, at least have a uniform system and be able to map that, have people be able to go online, look at all that data, map it, and be able to view what those emissions are. So these are the four key components. There's other components and penalties and fees and a few other things, but these are the main ones that will be taking up an enormous amount of district effort over the coming years. And there's timing, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but these are very tight timelines. The statewide monitoring plan is supposed to be finished by October of this year, and then that just gives us until July of 2019, which is essentially 15 months to actually do the monitoring that the state has told us to do, which is not 15 months, sorry, I did my math wrong, 9 months, which is not possible. You cannot deploy in multiple communities all the monitoring equipment, purchase it, test it out, get out there, get the lease agreement, security, data systems out there in 9 months. So people recognize this, but we're not going to wait till October to start this work. We are doing some of it now, and we need to enhance that now and get a head start on that. And then the state's supposed to update that in January, presumably to add new locations and talk about the newer technologies that are available. So for community emission reduction plans, there's a similar schedule for the statewide framework in October of this year. And then we have about a year to actually finish a plan. So anyone involved with an air quality management plan knows developing a full plan with a full public process cannot be done in a year. So again, we need a head start on this. We need to identify communities ahead of time. We need to really get moving, and hopefully the state guidance conforms with what the district is going to already be doing. This one has kind of a 5-year check-in. So that's kind of the cycle we're thinking of, that these plans are more or less going to be about a 5-year effort. On the BARC, the best available retrofit control technology, again, there's going to be a statewide kind of clearinghouse that talks about the technology that's available. But we're obligated by the end of this year to have a schedule for BARC implementation, which we are reading as we're going to have as many rules in place as possible that are going to codify a schedule for all these facilities to put on BARC. And the end date that they will have to do that is only 5 years later, which for most facilities is probably reasonable 5 years, but for some of the larger facilities like refineries that are very complex, 5 years is pretty tight. But again, we're working in that direction. And then there was really no timeline on the emissions reporting, but CARB is hard at work on that and is looking at potential rulemaking that they will do next year. All right, so the key issues for us, those are the requirements. One of our main issues as this was moving through the legislature is there's just an enormous amount of obligations and requirements for local air districts to carry out as part of this program. And initially, when AB 617 was going through the legislature, there was no funding associated with it, zero funding. We're already very busy at the district with many of our programs, some of which overlap with the goals of AB 617, but this is more, and there was no funding. So we weren't, the statewide organization of all the local air districts weren't necessarily supporting it without the funding. That was kind of the sticking point. But we got promises of funding, and at least In this case, the promises were kept to, and a couple months later, we did get funding to implement. It's a one-time funding, at $27 million statewide, and we received $10.7 million of that. That allowed us to go to the board, I think, last month and add new positions to implement this program. I think it was about 40 positions, which we desperately need to do this right. The other piece of the funding was, we know that some of the, not just for the AQMP, as Dr. Liu mentioned earlier, but also to get emission reduction in these communities, there's going to be a need to have funding to help, those single truck owners that can't afford to get a new, cleaner truck. We're going to have to help some people be able to afford the new technology that's going to benefit these communities. So we're also asking for quite a bit of money to help. We had been asking for it in the context of the AQMP, but as this came up, we're really seeing how it could benefit both, not just the local community, but regional air quality. So as part of the cap and trade funding, $250 million statewide for mobile source emission reductions was allocated. And I put a plus there because there's another $300 million or so that's going to be competitive grants, which obviously we usually get our fair share of that. So you're asking how much money this year? That was statewide. So we got $107 million completely dedicated to our area, and we probably have between another $100 and $200 million that we hope to get through these competitive grant programs. And that doesn't include the light duty money that's coming to the area, and it doesn't include the voucher program. So there's more than that
VW money?
The what?
Does that include the VW money?
Does not include
It doesn't
the VW money.
does not.
So
Is that going to get out this year? That's one of the questions Cody and I had for you, actually. Do we have a timeline for when the VW money is? I mean, it's not us; it's the Air Resources Board. When they're going to get that out?
I think it's soon. They came out with that funding plan a couple months ago, and they discussed it. I'm just not recalling exactly.
And that's
what they
another
put in
few
there.
hundred million statewide.
Yeah, it's 300 over 400 million.
Over
statewide.
400 million.
So we should get our fair share of that. Another couple $100 million.
We're starting to talk about real money here.
Okay, so our concerns were funding, which, at least for this 1 year, we came out pretty well. I think we had estimated when the legislature was asking us what would this cost to implement per year, and working with the other districts, we came up with like 30 to 50 million per year. Of course, they hear the low end of that, and then they took a little bit off, but we did pretty well with that. And then obviously the staffing that is needed to do this work, to do the community ID process and the public process, the monitoring alone is it's essentially doubling our monitoring responsibilities. The community emission reduction plans, I mean, that's falling on my division. I need a whole team of a dozen people to be continually working on those. And then my entire rule staff is working on the BARC rules and the sunset of reclaim and trying to hit the deadlines. They're already doing that, but we need more staff to complete that. And then all the work with CARB on all these issues and all the interaction with CARB. It takes a lot of time. So again, thankfully, the board has approved some new positions, but then now we're stuck with the challenge of hiring those people and recruiting those people, and we're in the middle of that now. But we're competing with California Air Resources Board, which also part of this action received enough money to hire 50 positions. Other districts got money, and they're all hiring. There's 200 or 300 positions open in air quality for air quality experts in the state of California now. Hopefully, we'll get the best of the crop, but yeah, we are competing against each other. And then, as I mentioned before, the timings and the deadlines in almost every case are, I'll say, very challenging. I know earlier I said impossible, but at a minimum, very challenging.
Is there a penalty if we don't make these deadlines? It means they're linked to the budgets, I assume.
Anything in state law that you miss a deadline is subject to somebody suing and say you didn't meet the deadline.
Yeah.
Yes.
And not only that, the legislature can make your life pretty miserable if you don't comply with what they've told you to do.
Right. So we're on this. we're working really hard to hit all those deadlines, but it is challenging. So the community identification is really the piece right now that is getting most of everyone's attention, because this is the first step. We can't move into monitoring and scoping out the monitoring. We can't move into the emission reduction plans without knowing which communities we're going to go into. So that's actively being developed at the state level, but also at the local level. We recommended to CARB that rather than this being done at a high statewide level, that they should consider all the work that the local districts have done, not all local districts, but many local districts have done, to identify those communities that need the most help in this area. And CARB is listened to us. So right now, there's still some work on the criteria that's going to go into helping choose these communities and the public process that's going to go into that. We're planning a series of many, I don't want to give a number, but probably over 10 meetings throughout the whole basin to talk about this process over the next 2 to 3 months, and what our thoughts are on how to select communities and get that feedback. And that's going to be happening again starting in February. But regardless of that process, the end result of that is for us to come up with a list of communities that we think are best suited to get this attention, and a set of prioritizing those communities, because we obviously can't do them all at once. This would eventually end up going to CARB, and that's what happens when you talk too much, I guess. So eventually this would go to CARB. They would be blessed by their board, or it would go through our board previous to that. Again, a full public process, and then we would get started on moving in the monitoring. But again, as it becomes clearer, we're not going to wait for CARB's approval. We're going to have to start moving on some of these things. The CARB is also allowing for a provision for communities to nominate themselves. And it's not really worked out yet, but if you nominate, if a community wants to go to CARB and say, hey, I don't like the way that the local district prioritized us, we think we should get more consideration, then the CARB board can take that into consideration when they're approving. At the same time, the CARB can come talk to us or refer the community to us and see if they could be part of our process and be considered in with everybody else. So a lot of the details are still being worked out. So when we're trying to prioritize communities and look at communities, there's lots of data sets we can look at. We have the CalEnviroScreen, which you all know about. It essentially helps identify EJ communities throughout the state. We have our work we've done with our multiple air toxics exposure study in MATES, and we have 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer grids across the whole basin where we know exactly what the risk is from air pollution, as well as where that's coming from. And also we have all our toxics emissions reporting programs, our criteria emission reporting programs. We have a whole set of already approved or in process health risk assessments and our toxic hotspots program. And there's a whole set of other data sets that can be developed and used to help rank and prioritize these communities. But we really need community input throughout the basin to really know how to weight these different factors. It's really going to end up being kind of a weight of evidence approach at the end of the day. I know most of the talk was supposed to be on the ID, and I want to leave community ID, and I wanted to leave time to talk about that. But just real briefly, there's a statewide monitoring plan that's being developed. It's going to hopefully be flexible enough to allow the districts to deploy in the areas that need to be deployed with the technologies that we have, leveraging other monitoring programs that are going on, or existing monitoring programs, working with the communities in terms of citizen monitoring where appropriate. It's a big focus on real-time data, so people can see that in real time rather than waiting for a lab result, wherever that could be done. So there's a lot of effort going on here. We're very well situated on the low-cost sensor side because we have our AQ-SPEC program that is just constantly evaluating and figuring out which sensors are best for which purpose. So that's one of the things that puts us kind of ahead of the game here, CARB is also proposing to have their own version of an AQ spec, and we're still trying to figure out why, since we already have one. But there might be some overlap, but there's also, we're trying to make it more complementary so they can do certain types of work and we can do other types of work. And then the community emission reduction plans, I mean, I think these are probably least fleshed out at this point. Again, what I view it as is kind of these mini air quality management plans for a community, you know, setting targets and timelines for emission reductions. What is the baseline exposure? How can we improve that? What are the opportunities? What's cost effective? Kind of like an air quality management plan. And again, it's going to focus on not just stationary sources in those communities, but also mobile sources as well. I talked a little bit about BARCT, and again, this is a huge effort for our rulemaking staff. We have a very full rule calendar, something like 40 rules scheduled to come to our board at one time or another in the coming, this year, and probably 60 to 70% of it is because of this effort to make sure that every facility is going to put on BARCT by 2023. And emissions reporting, this is not as much of a kind of a resource effort, but we want to make sure that if CARB is going to have this statewide system of emissions reporting, that, and we have our own system of emissions reporting, that they work in concert with each other, and that facilities don't have to report one set of data to the state and another set of data to us. We think a serial reporting, like it is being done now, is the best way to go, rather than having different criteria, different procedures, different reporting systems at different levels, which will inevitably have discrepancies in data and cause a lot of questions. So we're really trying to make the systems work together, but again, it's still being worked out. So our approach right now is obviously the close coordination with CARB is critical. We both have our roles. They need to understand what we view our role to be, and we understand what they view their role to be. And then, again, a lot of the work under here we were already doing or we're working on. You know, we were already working on sunsetting reclaim, and this codified that at the state level. We were already working on sensors and low-cost deployments. Now there's a requirement to do it. We're already monitoring in Paramount and Compton and many other communities that are impacted by toxics, and now there's a mandate to do that. So we need to see how all those things fit together in a way that makes sense. And the resource and workload needs, again, this is a major, major focus of the district, not just for this year or next year, but for at least 20 years to come, if not longer. The funding, continued funding, is critically important. We have funding for 1 year. If that funding runs out and we can't maintain those extra FTEs that are needed, then this is not going to be successful. So making the legislature understand that is as a high priority for us. And also, we need to have early successes and early actions to show the legislature that the funding, you're getting something for this funding. So obviously, we've been working on that as well. But again, the new FTEs help, and we're in the process of recruiting and trying to get those folks in and starting work immediately. So it was probably long-winded, but happy to answer any questions.
Sure. Before we do, we had a couple of people come in a little bit late. Woody and Mary, do you want to introduce yourselves? Nice to see you. Thank you, Mary. Professor Hernandez.
Great, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It's very exciting. I had a question about some of the ways to identify communities. I was wondering if the part of the process for and the criteria for identifying these communities, does that involve looking at the appropriate levels of geography, such as census tracts or municipal boundaries, or has that already been decided?
It hasn't been decided, and that's a good question because there's no set way to do that, and I don't think the state's going to dictate that either. In terms of the data sets, we have Cal and Virus Screen at the census tract level. We have our MATE study at the 2-kilometer grid level. There's other data sets that are at different scales. And just using municipal boundaries, obviously air quality doesn't respect a municipal boundary or a county boundary. So we've been kind of working on like defining not communities to be identified, but just ones to be considered. That, you know, and how to do that in a way that makes sense. And you look at things like, I mean, city boundaries mean something, but you also look at the collection of sources that they might be exposed to. And if you have a community or some adjacent communities that are exposed along the 710 freeway, for instance, and they're all kind of in the same situation, you might want to combine some of that into one type of area that you can address in the same way. Or if they're around refineries, you could. It's not an exact science at this point, but we're not doing this. Well, we are doing it in a vacuum now, but we're going to go out to the communities and ask, like, does this make sense? Should we be cutting it finer? Should we be combining? But we need to start somewhere. So we're starting to play around with some very rough, general, fuzzy boundaries and trying to define some areas that then can be scored and with different criteria and weighted against each other.
So it's a pretty fluid sort
Yeah.
of construct at this
Right,
point, because
right.
the term community connotes,
Yeah.
many different things.
Right. But I mean, there's definitely areas we know need attention, right? So those will be easier than the ones that are, haven't really had the focus for air quality issues before and trying to figure out how to do that. But it's a great question and no answers yet. But again, we need the feedback from the people living there, whether it makes sense or not, right?
Okay, so I have Mary, then Professor Beeson, then David, and then Carrie. Okay, so Mary, you go first.
So this is probably more of a comment and request for input to this. So thank you for the report. That's very informative. Here's the concern. So I'm going to accept blame for the fact that last year we were supposed to host some of the community meetings. Danny Morales did in San Bernardino, and Riverside County basically still hasn't, and that was my fault. So I'll accept blame for that one first. Here's the frustration, though. The frustration ends up coming in when the majority of the community doesn't even know some of the concerns and some of the exposure and some of the risks that they have health-wise. And many of them are probably the ones that are the most impacted. Because even I, in attempting to, even talk to some of the community about some of the community meetings we wanted to host last year, it's almost like a whole entire awareness process of trying to explain to them, did you know that living next to the freeway and next to the railroad tracks puts you at risk just because of where you live? I mean, the railroad tracks right in back of your backyard and the freeway's on the other side. And they don't even know that. And then as I'm looking at the information that you're providing, here's the other part. A lot of this information is like another language to people. They don't even know half of the words. And let me put myself in there. When I get the agenda and stuff, I go home and then I underline parts that I don't know what it means, and then I look it up. But that's my effort towards trying to make sure that I know what I'm doing. They're so busy just trying to survive in the world that they don't have time to go home and, gee, what's affecting my kids? Why does my child have asthma? Even though we have in our region Loma Linda University, which is renowned for the reports and the work that it does, especially with children, we continue to have issues in our region, in the Inland Empire, that something like this assembly bill is great. But here's the issue. We don't have like so much of the exide issues, because that was a great champion effort that this agency did for that community. Okay. Our problem is the proliferation of all those warehouses that we have. That's ours. Woody and I were on our way here, and we came a different way, and there's a whole lot of new warehouses out there that we hadn't even seen before. And they continue to go up. Here's the thing, Dr. Liu. This agency is great at monitoring. It's great at providing assistance, but it seems like the assistance is probably more relegated towards in being able to enforce businesses, being able to enforce private enterprises, than it is trying to assist communities to enforce government entities. Because here's the thing, even in our city, the city continues to build next to the railroad tracks, to build next to the 91 freeway, even though you have groups, you really do have groups that go in front of these government agencies and say, we don't want any more of this. We don't want this. They still vote for it. And so there's the frustration. You've still got these groups out there that are saying that they're doing what they can, that are informed, but then you have all these other ones that are not. So I think that what I'm trying to say is this is probably very, 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 very timely in that it will give us a hands up to be able to get out into the community. But part of that outreach that you're talking about doing is education and awareness, because they haven't a clue about what things impact them and their kids. They're so busy, they don't have time to find out those. So it's almost like, I hate saying it, but it's like we kind of almost have to scare them. We almost have to scare them into realizing what's there and what's waiting for them. So
We take a little bit of a Joe Friday approach and try to stick to the facts because, just purely emotional appeals can backfire sometimes, but I understand exactly what you're saying. And I would agree that this isn't, the first step is really making sure that you have informed communities. And that's a necessity of our public affairs department to make sure that everyone understands what the facts are about all this. And it is an enormous task. So that's what you can do too, help take that message back to the folks and do the best you can. The other thing you alluded to was this, continuation of bad land use decisions. And how I look at AB 617 is I spent a large portion of my career trying to take environmental justice issues and principles and concerns and transform those into policy. And there were a whole lot of things that were on that list. But the two most difficult ones were cumulative environmental impacts and land use. And so this AB 617 is trying to get at that cumulative environmental impacts issue. And really for the first time saying, you need to come up with an emissions plan to deal with the problems in these impacted communities, above and beyond what your rules already get you and everything else. So it really is looking at the cumulative burden on communities in a way that's never been tried before. It doesn't get to that issue of local land use decisions. One thing that can and may a little bit that I did leave off, and you missed it, was that we are going to consider how to approach this idea of indirect sources, and staff's coming back to the board in March and going to, for warehouses, for port facilities, for railroads, for airports, I'm not sure what else in terms, and perhaps development in general. They're going to come back with some ideas on how to approach this issue. So it's a very complicated thing and a difficult one. And there are limits to our authority. Explicit things in the health and safety code that says that we do not have land use decision-making authority. And there's a good reason for that. On the other hand, we do have authority for facilities that attract a lot of mobile source air pollution to force them to do something about it. And so that's another huge issue that we're grappling with. And that's got to be one that keeps Phil up at night. Okay, Professor Beeson.
Yeah, I want to come back to the best available control technology, maybe a couple of questions. One is there a single place where all the technologies are fully described, so an agency doesn't have to go here for this technology and a different place for that technology and so forth. So that's one question. Is there a central repository of listing of all the technologies? And the second one is, who has the ultimate responsibility for determining the best? In other words, among competing technologies, who has the final say as to which technology is the best for this particular application?
Okay, so your first question, is there a central repository? I would say currently no. But this legislation asks for one. And there's good things about that, but there's some pitfalls with that. And let me tell you why, and it gets to your second question. So when you're talking about best available control technology on a new facility, we call that BACT, or federal language, it's lowest achievable emission rate. That's a little easier to do, because if someone's going to build a new factory, a new business, they just want to know what they have to do and what it's going to cost, and then they can price it into the project and see if they can get their investors, and they want to see what that is. And we do have a clearinghouse for BACT. We have a document. It's being updated relatively frequently now. And then there's federal resources for that too. When you get to retrofit controls, these are existing facilities that would have to change their process or change a control device. Yeah, the BARC, that's what we're doing with Reclaim. That's where you run into some problems, because at the end of the day, when you're considering what's the best available retrofit control technology by state law and by federal law, that you do take cost effectiveness into account, right? Cost per ton or pound of pollution reduced. And the decision of what is too much cost or too little cost depends on a lot of factors. And at the end of the day, it's how bad your air pollution problem is. And then you have a policy board like our board who has to decide how much are you willing to spend to make air cleaner. Is $1 billion too much? Is $1 million? What is it? 1,000? Whatever it is. So each board has their own prerogative to set their cost effectiveness limits. And when you set a cost effectiveness limit, in effect, you're changing what is considered the best available retrofit control technology. So when the state says we're going to have a clearinghouse of just the best, they have to include with that, like that's the best in South Coast, because the South Coast board says 50,000 per ton is cost effective, but the San Joaquin board says it's 10,000 per ton. So you'll get different technologies, right? So there's an inherent policy choice in many of those decisions that needs to be accounted for. So that's where we get a little nervous about the state saying this is the best. I mean, our criteria are the strictest in the state, I could safely say, for 99% of the sources. But does that mean that a small district up in the northern part of the state, that their county board would say, yeah, that's the same, that little facility would have to spend the same amount? So you got to be a little careful with that. Did I answer your question?
Who has the final say?
Yeah. At the local level, it's the district boards who make those decisions.
I'm going to choose this technology. No, that's not the best.
Right. Well, it depends how you do it. It's usually technology neutral. It's an emission standard. So you have a boiler. You say you should be 8 parts per million NOx. Whatever you can do to achieve that, we don't care. Right.
Yeah, it gets really complicated, because is that boiler for big boilers and little boilers, or is that boiler for, other things, or do you even need a boiler? Can you do this some other way? It's really, really complicated on.
Threshold in one geographical area might be a different threshold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And pretty much it's Phil's decision.
Oh, now that I know that, I can proceed much differently.
Okay, David.
Just wanted to kind of pick up on where Ms. Figueroa left off in terms of the voiceless communities. How would you nominate a community to be in this process? I mean, it hasn't been figured out yet, right?
Well, the state's about to come out with some white papers and documents and frameworks that are going to start describing that. But I would encourage any community in the basin who has an interest to take part in our public process, which is going to be kicked kicked off next month. But if you have questions, I mean, you feel free to call me or.
So notification will come out,
Yeah.
and people can find a way to click through and nominate themselves. And then I guess some of the things that I'm looking at, the Enviro screen deals with DAC, disadvantaged communities, and I think it gives kind of points for that. It's like it's scoring, and you can identify that and check that box, and it might move you up the priority ladder. But I don't know if you're going to be using that kind of process to deal with things like, I know certain communities have airports, and certain communities have oil drilling, and certain communities have traffic or just freeways. I'm just trying to think in a regional standpoint how you approach it, because certainly I don't think it'll be community standpoint. It'll be this 4-mile radius.
Yeah. Yes, it's going to be tough to prioritize, obviously. We can't prioritize everybody at the top because we have to make some choices about where we go first. But we also don't want to do that in a vacuum. We need to get that community input, and hopefully some consensus can be reached. But we cannot I don't know how many, as we draw these fuzzy lines, there's going to be 50, 60 areas that we're going to be considering, and you can't do that in the first year. We're going to be doing, to be quite honest, 2 or 3 maybe a year, maybe a chunk in certain years that are similar.
And have some lessons learned during that process. Well, most importantly, I think the whole case is this outreach piece is very much, I think, an awareness and an education piece, as well as, getting input to educate people to give input. That's the only way you're going to get qualitative input. So I think it's a 2-piece, and I don't know which is the most important, but you want to let them know what they're talking about before you ask them for their input.
Yeah, understood. And I know there are a lot of terms in my presentation. This presentation was meant for people who have been working with us for a while and know some of the terms. But as we go to the community, this would not be the presentation that we do.
And just for your information, in terms of the California Air Resources Board, the person who's heading up the program is Karen Magliano. If you want to self-nominate, or people who would want to self-nominate, I would certainly make sure that they're on her list. And she has formed an advisory committee. I don't know if it's finalized. I've certainly seen a list of people, and you can look at that advisory committee list and see if there's anyone that you know or should know, and when they're going to be meeting, to make sure that you're part of that process to be considered. Who would be the best person to speak with here?
Just contact me for now.
Yeah.
And when we get the new staff in, and I can assign some people, there'll be another staff, but I just don't have that yet.
Yeah, he's trying to find the poor unfortunate soul who has to do that. Thank you, David. Okay, Carrie, then Danny, and then Evelyn.
Thank you very much for the presentation. But it was complicated enough for me to not be able to take accurate notes, and so if I could get a copy of the PowerPoint, I'd really appreciate it.
Package, right?
In your packet.
Oh, it is. Okay. Thank you. I guess my assistant didn't print that part. And regarding this whole process, there were a whole lot of angry people last Saturday in Torrance regarding the Torrance oil refinery hearing, and I want to publicly commend Dr. Liu for coming out early on a Saturday morning and listening to literally hundreds of angry people talking about modified hydrofluorides and how upset they were.
I actually felt really good about it because I expected to be there till 3, and we got out a little after 2, and so it was a good day. I was concerned that staff, I can say it now, staff told me on Thursday, I think it was last week, we have the room till 3 o'clock, and I went back and told my wife, oh, good, I'm going to be done by 3 o'clock. And then when we got there on Saturday morning, they said, well, if we need to, we can actually extend it till 6 o'clock. I'm like, don't tell me that. So anyway, yes, we had angry people on a lot of different sides of the issue, but that's the job.
Absolutely. And so that's why I had to publicly congratulate you for devoting your whole Saturday in addressing all of those. But not being a scientist, I have no idea what the effects of modified hydrofluorides really are. But there were a whole lot of angry people talking about it. I was wondering if your air quality monitors, how accurate they were, or they are, and do they monitor the levels of MHF?
So hydrofluoric acid is not something that is typically monitored just in general throughout the basin. It's not something you generally find in the air, and it's generally not something you find in the air unless something has gone horribly wrong at the source, right?
Which did happen.
Right. So what we have now is at the refineries, both refineries have sensor systems that essentially surround the area where the alkylation, the HF alkylation is occurring. They will detect even small leaks, and then that data is sent to us. They're supposed to take some actions. We're supposed to take some actions. That's on site. There is a project in the city of Torrance now for some fence line and community monitoring that will do some more community level monitoring of hydrofluoric acid, and potentially some on the fence line. And then we just passed a Rule 1180, that's going to require all the refineries in the basin to do their own fence line monitoring and give us money to do community monitoring. And for the refineries that do have, in the areas that do have refineries with hydrofluoric acid, we will be measuring hydrofluoric acid there too. But typically it's just not something that anyone in the country does in terms of just monitoring all the time. It's really something that you want to have in case, there's an accident.
So the answer is yes.
There's some on site now, and within the next year or so, there will be some at the fence line and some in the community.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. In case some of my neighbors ask me about it, I'll be able to say yes. That the monitors do measure the air quality with regard to hydrofluorides. And so along those same lines, you talked about using CalEnviroScreen. And I've always wondered about how accurate or how encompassing CalEnviroScreen is, especially compared to U.S. EPA's EJ screen. From what I've heard, the CalEnviroScreen is a little bit different in that it captures a lot of information with regard to fertilizers, more pertinent to rural areas, and not to offend my friends in the rural areas, but if it does bend toward favoring rural areas, then perhaps we should take a look at the EJ screen.
We can. So none of these tools are perfect. That's why they're all called screen and not final answer, right? So CalEnviroScreen takes a lot of different factors into account and comes up with kind of a statewide ranking, and we could take that and do an in-district ranking too. And I think that's the way we're going to look at it, instead of trying to define community rankings based on what something might be happening in a rural area. We'll just be looking in our area, and other districts are taking that approach. EJ screen's a little different. It's kind of this relative extra impact type of model that does things differently. I guess we will look at all of it, right? There's a lot of overlap as well. We had our own environmental justice area definitions that were based on some pretty different factors that went into CalEnviroScreen, and lo and behold, when you overlay it, they line up pretty well, 80-90% line up.
We still use them for Moyer funding.
Yeah. So, I think in some of our programs we're using one, some we're using the other, some we're using either or. I think there's a kind of a push to try to make our work consistent with CalEnviroScreen to the extent possible, but it doesn't happen overnight. There's a lot of considerations that have to go into that. But that's just one factor. We have much more detail. The data that goes into CalEnviroScreen, the data that goes into EJ Screen, we have more refined data than they're using. So when we have that data, we will use it.
Go ahead, Danny next, and then Evelyn.
I have about 3 questions. The first one, it was mentioned that CARB is going to come up with criteria and process for the nominations. Has that already happened, or do we know possibly when?
They're going to start releasing some information probably within a month, and that's very draft and high level. And then they'll, as the year goes on, they will be getting more specific. And October is kind of their deadline, but they also realize that they have to really get a little more far along on things because they can't have everything happen at the same time in October. You can't identify communities and have your monitoring plans set up all concurrently. You need to do one and then the next and then the next. So we're all working through that. It's not just CARB. We're all trying to figure out how to hit these deadlines. But you're right, this is a little premature because a month or two from now, you'll start seeing much more concrete frameworks and structures in place to do this.
Okay, also mentioned that CARB was going to develop a database by January. Has that been done?
Database for what?
To compare the different districts.
You're talking about the control technology database?
Yeah.
I had the deadline here.
It says they were going to come up with it by January of this year.
No, it shouldn't have been. If that would have been a mistake. The clearinghouse, I'm not sure it had a deadline. I don't have it listed in here. But they are working on it. They're already trying to work on the data, the systems that are going to display that. And they've already asked us for our data on what we consider the best controls.
Yeah, it couldn't have been January 1st of this year because the law actually didn't
Take effect
till January 1st of this year.
I'm not sure that particular element has a deadline, but again, they're looking towards next year to get something online.
Final question is, I know this is going to take a long time and everything. You're going to identify the cities that are going to be monitored. What can we expect from the outcomes? Is it going to be you find something wrong in a city and is this going to come under AQMD authority and powers to enforce, or what happens is you're just going to have the information, then nothing is done? What are the outcomes?
So that's not the goal. The goal is through these community emission reduction plans that actions will be taken to reduce emissions, either that were known before we even went out there or that were found through the monitoring. So we fully expect that there may be some communities we don't even have to do the monitoring. We know what the problem is, right? And the community agrees with us we know what the problem is. We'll just jump right into actions. And there's some communities that have already told us this, like, we don't want any more monitoring, we know what the problems are, we just want action. There's other communities, maybe we do need to figure out some things, or we suspect some sources that may be non-compliant, or we don't have, our rules don't cover, and we're going to have to do some monitoring to figure that out. Then when we see what those sources are, some will be under our jurisdiction if they're stationary, some will be under CARB's jurisdiction, maybe we both have some authority over, and that's what plans do. They work out, who's going to do what and what's going to happen. So it's kind of open, but what's important is each one of these efforts in each community has to fit the community. It's not one size fits all, and the community has to have input into that. Some of these are going to look very different in different communities. So,
yeah, and I think, Dan, you really hit on something that's really important. And when it comes to the relationship between monitoring and emission reduction plans, we have a lot of emission reductions we know we need to do, but our experience, and I haven't had a chance to have a conversation with Dr. Fine about this, but I think back about all the times where we started doing monitoring and we had a real eye-opening experience. I mean, everything from XI to hexavalent chromium and Riverside by the cement kilns to, even when we did one of the early MATES studies, we found elevated styrene in Anaheim, I think it was. I mean, Paramount, right? Some community member says, God, I just keep smelling metal, I keep tasting it, and can you kind of do some monitoring? And lo and behold, we found hexavalent chromium levels that were off the charts. So the monitoring is important to find out, especially to find out the things we don't know. And unfortunately, we don't know what we don't know, but this process may actually help.
If I can add, Dr. Liu, there are these examples of where we find something by monitoring. I mean, there's dozens, but it doesn't always work that way. There's many, many cases we go out and monitor and can't find anything, even if there's a major odor problem, right? Sometimes odors you just can't monitor for. Your nose is a much better sensor. So for every time we go out and find one of these major problems that takes up our entire lives for the next 5 years, like Exide or Paramount, there's probably 2 or 3 other times we went out and monitored and maybe there wasn't a problem or we can't detect the problem. So it does go both ways.
That's it? Okay, those are good questions, though. Evelyn, Retta, and Woody.
My question has to do with, you talk about communities and you talk about areas, and some of the areas have lots of pollutants, and then there are communities that have varieties of things. So when you talk about communities and you talk about areas, are you talking about the same thing, or you in a community and an area?
Yeah, I think for this conversation it's the same because we really haven't figured out exactly how we're going to define these things, which it seems like state law expects us to have some real definitions. But at this point, it's just very general. Like, we know there's communities or areas that are impacted by sources that, or if there's concerns about sources that we do want to address. But where those boundaries lie, we don't know yet.
Okay, because there's in some areas there are lots of concentrations of people doing things in a community, and so I was just wondering, how do you handle that kind of communications in terms of what you're talking about? Is that pretty much? But your answer to that is pretty much how you do the whole thing.
Right. I mean,
Okay.
definitely some communities that are going to get a very hard look, or things like Paramount, where you have residential areas either right next to a whole bunch of
stuff.
toxic sources,
Yes.
or even in some cases residential properties interspersed in those areas. Those are the areas that we have already prioritized in our current programs. So we'll continue that as we move out into these other areas.
He hasn't been to your house yet, Evelyn.
Oh, no, you need to come on over and I'll show you where it's at.
I'd love to.
Anyway, the other question I have, the whole thing about the new legislation for the marijuana stuff and the smoke, and how kind of like toxic smelling, and how loud the smells, and how it just moves around. And some people, it's not medical, it causes problems. And I mean, some people, I for one can't stand to smell it. I mean, it just attacks my system with the odor of it. And so I was just wondering, is there in anticipation of that, the problems, solution that they say is going to, handle, and the problems that it's going to create at the same time?
So this is a new area for us, but we have had lots of inquiries on this, and there's certain questions about the authority we have, and the authority maybe cities have, and the different sources, and whether it's a grow operation or just so. We're still working through some of that, but I could definitely foresee that as we go to a community and this comes up as a major issue for them, if there's anything we could do within our authority or outside of our authority to help solve problems like that, then that's something that's fair game for these plans.
I would certainly like to see or meet the first inspector who writes a nuisance NOV for marijuana smoke, and maybe congratulate the first prosecutor who successfully takes a case on that. That's really is a new one, Evelyn. I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah.
Wow, that'll be some. Any other questions, Evelyn? But your first point, right? I mean, the question is like, oh, do we just take West Long Beach? or do we include Wilmington and maybe San Pedro? And if we're doing all that, do we actually include the places in Carson that are also impacted by the ports and the
Right.
rail yards and the refineries and, and everything else you have going on in your community? We don't know yet, right? We got to figure that out. And I think community input on that is really important, right?
Right,
It's like,
right.
hey, look, we're all in this. We're all in the port communities and with the refineries and the rail yards and everything else right here. So consider us all as one. Or why don't you take us, please take us first and don't worry about them till next year or till your next time you can expand the program. Those are really good, tough questions.
Right, right.
Okay. Retta and Woody.
Well, thank you for your presentation, and I can see, as all have said as well, this is a very important bill, and everyone has their work cut out for them, that's for sure. I'm wondering, and it touches on what Danny mentioned also, the measurable outcomes as a result of all of this effort, the identification of the communities, the monitoring, the technologies, whatever. Where might one look to see that, the measurable outcomes that will improve the quality of the air in all these identified communities?
So I think as you'll see, as CARB starts releasing kind of their statewide framework, they're going to have kind of a list of things that they would be looking to see in these community emission reduction plans. And metrics is part of that. Measurable outcomes is going to be part of that, at least from what we've seen kind of being developed. But the way I see these plans being developed in the community is very similar to AQMP, which essentially is what are the impacts, what's the exposure, and what are the sources, and what's the relationship there? What is toxic risk? What is your lead exposure? What is your criteria pollutant exposure? And then looking at what's already being done. There's things being done all the time to reduce that, right? There's the dirtier trucks are being changed out. There's rules that we have that are on the books but haven't been fully implemented yet. So there will be improvements that come even if we don't necessarily do anything new in these plans. But we need to look at that. And then you look at, well, what else can we do beyond that? What are the opportunities to go beyond that for this particular community? And then figuring out how to make that happen. And then once you do that, you have to figure out how to have the metrics and the measures to make sure that once that's done, you have the desired outcome. That could involve monitoring the community, see the levels come down. It could involve some emissions testing to make sure emissions from a certain facility came down. It could involve, traffic studies. If one of the measures was to move a truck route off to a different area because it was exposing a school over here, and you could have metrics for that. Wide variety of things, but again, those get developed within the plans, right?
Great. Woody, thanks for your patience.
Not a problem. Thank you. The question I had, so we can think about something like this in the future, has to do with, as we're talking about education outreach, do we have best practices that reflect the community and the government and private sector working together as it applies to reducing emissions, et cetera? Because they're going to continue to build warehouses. Those bring jobs. They're going to continue to have, the plants and et cetera. They've been there all along. They're not going to get rid of them. So at some point, even as we educate the populace as to the effects of, we need to also be able to say, however, in this community, this was done. And it works. Now, it may not necessarily work completely in our community, but it could be a hybrid or whatever. But do we have anything like that?
So I personally haven't seen that compiled. I know of some examples of that, how much that is used as a model or gets publicized out to other areas. You're probably right, it probably doesn't. But I do think that this program provides an opportunity a real opportunity to do things maybe differently. I mean, maybe there are some good models out there that we'll follow or try to follow, but this is an opportunity when you're really community focused. Like, you're not just going to the community to talk to the community members who are upset at us. You're going to bring in the businesses, you're going to bring in the local business owners, you're going to bring in the Chamber of Commerce, you're going to bring in the city, you'll bring in the Boy Scouts, you'll bring in everybody that you can. Half of the people have never even thought about air quality before, if we can get them out. And maybe there's creative ideas about how everyone can work together and bring some of this about. And I think if we could bring some resources, and when I say resources, like in a lot of cases financial resources, that we can actually help some of the smaller businesses that you normally just get scared when we step foot anywhere near them. That, like, you want to modernize your facility, we can help with that. Because it's going to have benefits for the community, it's going to have benefits for you, your bottom line perhaps. So I think there's going to be some opportunities for some really creative but like model situations, and then as we get going, we'll repeat that as we go. But if anyone has examples of that really working really well, we're all ears to try to replicate that.
I have about almost 28 years of experience of it not working well. There have been some exceptions. We did negotiate a community benefits agreement with the Los Angeles World Airports. They didn't fulfill all their commitments, but it really changed the dynamic of the relationship of LAX to the environmental justice communities that surround it. In Riverside, CCAEJ negotiated a Good Neighbors Agreement, right, that I thought was pretty precedent-setting. I'm not sure how well it was implemented, but it was there. Certainly I can tell you, don't do it as it was done at Exide, because that was a complete disaster in my opinion. Think about how we did the outreach and efforts when we first found out about the problems at Paramount. We set an example of community engagement and reaching out to local governments and involving them that I think was very unique in its success and very good in its example. So there are things where we can bits and pieces of experience over the years where we have and have done that fairly well. But I agree with Dr. Fine. It's going to be a new experience, and we're going to really have to try to make this the example. And that's what the intent is. And, I don't think anything ever goes really well unless you have someone looking over your shoulder, and the legislature is certainly going to do that. And even the governor mentioned this bill in his State of the State address yesterday. So I think, he won't be around after the end of this year, but there'll be a new governor. I'm sure that new governor will care about this too. And the legislature has changed very dramatically over the course of the last couple decades. And they are going to, all indications that these type of issues in this bill are going to remain a high priority for them. So if we screw up, I think they'll be right on us.
And I would add, I didn't mention specifics, but we did some pilot studies starting 5 or 6 years ago, our Clean Communities plan, that I think can be considered successful. I'm not sure we solved all the problems in the community, but at least the interactions and the way that we worked with the communities and the local businesses and brought resources to those areas or communities to solve some of the problems, I think was a successful model. The downside is the amount of resources that took. Like, we can't, it's really hard to repeat it at that level, throughout the basin and all these communities.
David and Evelyn, do you have another point to make? No, okay, so David.
No, I just wanted to educate me a little bit on the grant component of this project. I know you'd hire staff, but what kind of grants would be available to help the solutions?
Well, it could take a wide variety of forms. So the current grant funding that's available that came, as I showed in my presentation, has really been directed towards some existing programs that do kind of like mobile source equipment change out, older trucks, older buses, older off-road equipment, things like that. But those programs are kind of set in their ways. What we hope to do is, if there are subsequent rounds of funding, is to loosen things up a bit. So some of that could be directed towards stationary sources or some other types of projects as needed for this community focus, because those programs were all designed to get basin-wide emissions. So there's already changes being made to help that. I do think it needs to be opened up more to stationary sources. We have a request for proposals out on the street now that's almost, could be as much as $60 million in funding that is open to stationary sources. That's district money that's been collected over the years, and mitigation funds and penalties and things like that to get us kind of rolling on that, because that's not enough money, even 60 million. So if we can show some successes with a program like that, I think we can go to the legislature and say, hey, as you're allocating incentive money, not just for regional air pollution, but to implement AB 617, carve out some for some of these stationary source projects.
The funding bill also included $5 million to provide technical assistance to community organizations so they could engage effectively in this process. Cal EPA will be making those awards. I'm not exactly sure if they've set up any, or how much progress they've made in figuring out exactly how they're going to get that money out and to whom. But there is money for community-based organizations, which I think this group certainly might care about. Probably Karen Magliano at the Air Resources Board might be the first person to talk with. Maybe Yana Garcia, who is the Cal EPA assistant, I think, Deputy Secretary, Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice, may also know.
Veronica.
Oh, Veronica Eady, yes, of course. Yeah, Veronica Eady at the Air Resources Board. She's definitely up to her neck in this stuff. Eady, E-A-D-Y. Have we finally exhausted all the comments from the staff? That's really, I really, oh, we have one more. Donald, and you didn't get to introduce yourself either, so go ahead, Don.
I'm Donald Smith. I'd like to apologize. I had a conflict in scheduling, the reason why I'm late. I had a question that I noticed in my community of Rosewood, Compton area, where the streets are so degraded that when the street sweeping comes by, it leaves a lot of airborne particles in the air. And I was just wondering, is any study on emissions, what's in the asphalt and how it's airborne? Because I noticed that when I see the street sweepers, it's a cloud behind the street sweepers, and all of these little particles are now airborne.
Yeah, I'm not aware of really looking at the asphalt components, but there's been lots of work done to make sure that these street sweepers don't do what you just said, that actually collect the
But it was
dust.
more about the brushes and stuff. It wasn't about the integrity of the street itself.
It's the brushes, but more the filtration systems
And,
that are on the street sweepers. And actually, we've noticed some things in Compton recently that suggest that there needs to be some work done in that area. But I'm not sure how much or how little the condition of the road contributes to that. I could see, like, kind of intuitively, it would probably make the street sweeping less efficient, but that's a good point. I don't think that I've seen studies on that.
Well, with these low-cost air quality sensors, we could certainly grab one, follow a street sweeper down a rough road and a clean road, and see what kind of different measurements we got.
Right. But those types of issues are perfect for this program. Those are things I think we can actually solve relatively quickly as they come up. And if
Really? You can fix the streets?
No, the sweepers.
The sweepers. You might be able to fix the sweepers, but you're not going to be able to. Yeah.
We could talk to the people who can fix the streets.
Yeah, almost. Good point. Good point. Okay, so we've. Oh, yes.
Just a quick question. Does the AQMD share their data with any other agencies like the California Environmental Public Health Tracking Network? Do you
Not
know?
familiar with that, sharing with that group.
That's Paul English.
It is Paul English?
Yeah.
So we've had some projects with Paul, but what we have been doing lately is sharing enforcement information and violation information with other local jurisdictions, cities and counties. So that's something we're trying to do more of, so they get a better sense of what is in their area, and because they're making permitting decisions also, for CUPs and things, and they've they would probably want to know if they have a facility who is racking up violations with us. So we're trying to improve that type of data exchange. There's other specific things we're doing where there's data exchange with county public health and other agencies, but
And
nothing.
emissions data are public information.
Right.
So, I mean, anybody who wants it can get it. They might need to file a Public Records Act request. But we all know Paul, and we all know the tracking stuff that he's doing. And
That's
I think
really
if he needed
wonderful.
it, he would just ask.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Go ahead, Daniela.
I'm sorry if this was already made obvious, but of the money that we're receiving, is that being counted towards the $1 billion goal of the AQMP?
Yeah, the 100 million, yeah, everything we receive for incentive programs is counted towards that goal. What's really counts towards the goal is getting the emission reductions with that money. I don't want to get too focused on, on the dollars. It's more about the emission reductions. But yeah, I mean, that's the reason that it was there, the reason we got 100 million, and there's another 300 million in competitive grants, and more went to the voucher incentive program. Part of that was the AQMP called for it. And even though some people thought we were crazy, the legislature, eventually realized that this is how we're going to, achieve clean air. And they didn't give us everything, but they gave us a big chunk. So we're very happy with that, but it needs to continue.
Yeah, and we have to prove that we know what we're doing, or else they're not going to continue to give us the money. We will bring this issue back because this is going to be going on forever. So we will, and this obviously this advisory committee has a unique interest in this issue. So as things develop, we'll come back and talk about this some more. I was wondering if we had any members of the public who wanted to address this issue or ask questions. Oh, it's no. I think Dr. Hassan, you did get to introduce yourself when you came in, right? Oh, yes, he did. Okay. Okay. No questions from the public. Let's take till 1:45 and then a little break and come back and deal with the rest of the agenda. Okay. That's the only way we're going to get it through. also works with CVAC, like now. Right. So, yeah, so, Genevieve was on, the one, the 9510 one, that she's in Fresno. She might be our hero. Yeah. That's been a problem. Yeah. Well, that's the ones on my phone, which kind of go out right away. No, it was probably because I forgot what it says. And I asked her about it yesterday, whether she got that email, and she said yes. That was yesterday. And she was there when they all walked in. Oh, yeah. Oh no!
So you guys might be fed.
Stop by the office this afternoon and go eat some donuts. That's your work assignment for Friday afternoon. Probably when I press send and receive on other emails I send out.
Yeah. Okay. That's why I told her.
Been that way forever. Well, because I don't have mine set to go out as soon as I press send. It's supposed to wait a minute, right? Don't press send. Yeah, that's general policy. Don't press send.
Sometimes, yeah, I wait for
Exactly. Yeah. And other times, you don't really need to because then someone else will resolve it. Candace, Marcus Segura work both there, and Maya Goldcrasser all work at CBB downstairs. Yeah, they all ended up the same place. And then Adrian showed up, and then Jennifer from PSRLA. Great. Nice little competition. Victor came too, yeah. Yeah, it was great. Yes.
Yeah.
Candace had worked for everybody in the room. Except for Earth Justice. She hasn't worked for Earth Justice. Yeah, maybe later. That's her next job, Earth Justice. No, she has to become an attorney. Got her MPH. Right? She left us to go to credit. I get that you were dragging it out. I don't know how I'm going to find somebody to do what you do. You know my terms up? Okay, look.
So happy.
2007.
I guess so.
You guys should know that. For me, it's a big relief if I don't get reappointed, right? I don't know if I want to do 16 years soon, right? Not for me. You guys are the ones that benefit from this much more. Do you need health insurance like past 20?
Really, my.
You do? Okay, well, and Angela and I, you haven't met Angela yet, but Angela's a character. Anyway, Angela and I are working together. We're like, we've got enough money to hire somebody. We're gonna hire her. She's never gonna stay. We'll have to hire someone new.
Sarah might know him.
I'll find out, Danny, before you leave.
I know. It was certainly that's the thing you kind of you put in
Wonderful Montana. I never lived there, so it's outside of Kaiser. My claim to San
Okay, folks, we're going to have to return, even though I'm kind of mid-bite, because we do have to get out of here. It is Friday. Well, 2 cheers for Friday, or 3 cheers for Friday. Let's see. We ended up off of item 4. We're now on item 5, which is EJ accomplishments, and Fabian's going to lead us through that, right?
Yes.
Attachment 3.
Absolutely. Is everyone reseated, refueled? In your packet is a 2-page sheet of EJAG 2017 accomplishments. I won't take the time to go through all of them, read all of them. If you haven't had a chance to read them, please take the time to read them. If you have read them and have any questions, please let us know. But I'd also like to take this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Liu, for allowing me. I know you probably have missed, or if you haven't, he is not here, and that is Mark Carroll, who has been an integral part of our environmental justice program for years. He and Daniela helped break me in. They've taught me everything that I know about environmental justice. Mark has had the unique opportunity. He stayed with us through the EJ conference on December the 2nd, and then on December the 4th, reported to his new position as executive director for Breathe LA. So we have lost Mark, but we have gained him still in the environmental justice community. So he still will be involved with us.
Can I jump in? 'Cause
absolutely.
That very next week, there was a hearing on that Tuesday at the downtown city hall about the clean air action plan at the ports, and there he was testifying. I took a picture of him, and I said, "So this is your first testimony as ED of Breathe LA?" And he said, "Yeah." So I texted it to him so he'd have a copy of that. So he's active, he's there, and still part of the community, just a different part.
Absolutely. And we'd also like to welcome Brandy Keith, who will be serving as our new EJAG secretary. Brandy's sitting down at the end. We'd like to thank Sam Atwood. She's in our media department, on loan for this. She's excited about working with the environmental justice, wanted to do it. So we appreciate you, Brandy. Hope you've gotten down all those questions that were asked about AB 617. Dr. Fine will appreciate that. And we thank you for all of those questions because they will be repeated as we go out into the communities, and we want to be prepared. We really want this to work. And Mary, I just got to tell you, on my notes, please tailor your presentation to the community. That's what I have in my notes, so I appreciate what you said. We've got to remember that in our education to the community, that a lot of what we know, they don't know, and it goes over their heads, which means we've defeated our purpose. So thank you for that.
Any questions or comments on the accomplishments for last year? I think we already kind of reviewed that a little bit in the last meeting. Okay. Any members of the public? Okay, great. My favorite part. We're going to do community updates, and I hope that we have some, because I love to hear what's going on in the communities. It's one of the important ways that we find out about things. I will volunteer Evelyn, not for the community she lives in now, but the community she used to live in, because she brought me this newspaper article, which is fascinating. Can you tell us about what happened?
Yesterday, a good friend of my family's called me and said that in the Los Angeles Times, there was a wonderful article about Africatown, Alabama. And she wanted to know if I, had access to it. And I said, yes, I had the paper, and I missed that. And so I went and grabbed the paper, and I saw it, and I was really excited. Africatown is a little community, and it's really a part of Mobile. But it was a community that was started by the Africans that were brought to Alabama on a ship called the Clotilde in 1860. And these two white men, one was a wealthy landowner in Mobile. His last name was Marr. And he and his friend decided to go to West Africa and bring a shipload of slaves into the Mobile harbor. And they went to an area which was Dahomey at the time, but now it's the country of Benin. And they brought 110 Africans into Mobile, and they didn't think that they were going to be detected, but they were. And the guards saw them, and they intercepted them, but they ended up taking the shipload up to the plantation where they lived, because they couldn't get them back to Africa. So what were they going to do with them? So they took them with them, and they let other people. So 5 years later, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and they went back to the area where they brought them in. And somehow when they were there, they got some resources, and they bought some land from the guy that had brought them there, because he owned all the land in that area. And so they established their own community and established their own village, and they developed their village like they had lived in Africa, in a collective with each other. And they shared, they grew their crops, they built their homes, and they invited other people to come and be a part of that community. And this story was well known pretty much because it appeared in the newspapers, many of the newspapers in different parts of the country. But the ship that they brought him in, they took it into a river on Mobile, part of that land where how they got them from the ocean by means of the river. And this ship, they set it on fire to burn it up, to destroy the evidence that what they had done. Anyway, the people, we grew up with stories of where that ship was, and as a matter of fact, we thought we saw it when we were growing up. But the community was really a very productive, self-sufficient community that built its own school, built its churches, and had stores in it. It was self-sustaining. We had one policeman that was deputized by the city of Mobile, and he lived on the next street from where we lived all my life. And he just took and maintained. If a person had a problem, they would go to George Mills and take their problem, and he would, counsel them and communicate with them, and nobody was ever killed or murdered by the policeman. So January of this year, one of the persons who wrote for the newspaper in Mobile decided that he was going to go looking for the remnants of that ship, and he found it. He thinks he found it. The ship was made during the time that this ship that they were brought in on. This guy did his research in 2007. Sibian Diouf, who is the is employed by the Schomburg in New York, had gone to Mobile and did a lot of research. She was Senegalese from Dakar, Senegal. That was her home. And she went back to Benin and did research, and she talked with some of the ancestors and a lot of the people who were connected with the community over the years. And she documented, and she wrote this book in 2007, Dreams of Africa in Alabama. So this guy read and researched this information that Sibian had put together and all the other people had put together over the years, and he figured out where that ship was, and he went and he found it. And so that article was in LA Times yesterday. And I gave Joe a copy of it because he had bought, when I told him about the story several years ago, he said he had bought some copies of the books and shared them with his friends. And he was sharing my excitement and my love for my community that I was born in. My grandparents came when they were babies, and my mom and her 6 siblings and me and my 9 siblings were all born in Africa Town. And I've been keeping up with everything. I go back there to the class reunions. My parents are buried in the cemetery, the local cemetery where the Africans are all buried. There are monuments to the Africans in there. They have now named the main street going through Africa Town Boulevard. And some friends of mine in Long Beach have gone back there and visited. So, the public television, Henry Louis Gates has interviewed people and done stories and documentaries on it. So the word is getting around. And it's the only ship that they know the name of everybody who came on that ship. And that's the only ship that they know where it is and can identify that, they brought Africans from Africa. They can identify everything about it. So the story is one that is well documented, well known, and you're going to hear more about it. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Evelyn. You don't have to top that story, Woody, but any community update will do.
I wasn't about to top that. Number one, Evelyn is known in history as a primary source because she lived where that was. But the thing that I was going to add to that was that Africa Town, and there were just a few around in the United States, similar, was a true example of what could have been done had we received our 40 acres and a mule.
Of course.
I'm still waiting on mine.
All right. Yeah, and I think, did I tell you I went to Benin back in October? When you had your last board meeting, I was in Benin. Yeah, I told my friends who we go somewhere every year, but we're going to Africa, and I told them I wasn't going back to Africa unless I went to Benin, where they brought my people from.
Wow, okay. Other community updates? Anyone have anything for us? Anything new going on? Any new concerns, issues? Anything we can address? No? Seriously? Are you kidding me? Okay.
I gave Retta a copy
Yes, you
of
did.
the article, and if anybody else want one, I have some extra ones. So
Yeah, I appreciate
I
that.
give it to you.
Any members of the public want to address this issue? No? Okay, then we are going to get out pretty quickly. That concludes item number 6. Item number 7 is other business, anything that wasn't on the agenda that you need to talk about. Feel free to do so now, members of the public. Then public comment period on item 8. If anyone, members of the public, would like to address this body on anything relevant, you're more than welcome to. Well, hearing none, that brings us to announcing our next meeting, which is Friday, April 20th, right here, 12 o'clock. And thank everyone again, and we will adjourn. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.